Welcome back, everybody. I have some exciting news today. Zeiss is back. Today, Zeiss made the announcement that we now have a new series of what they're calling ML Otus lenses. These are Otus lenses that are designed for mirrorless cameras. The first lens to be released is going to be the Otus ML 50mm f1.4, which will be followed later this year with an 85mm f1.4. These lenses are designed for mirrorless systems, and they will come in 3 different mounts. I'm testing the Sony E mount version, but it will also be available for Nikon Z mount as well as Canon RF mount. So when Zeiss approached me and said, we've got a pre-production version of the 50mm f1.4, would you be interested in checking it out? I got really excited. The Otus series of lenses, when these were made for DSLRs back in the day, were really representative of the pinnacle of where Zeiss was. They were the best lenses you could possibly get in that era, so I really wanted to see what they were going to do with the mirrorless system. Now, I do want to note that I only had a few days with this lens. It had to go back, so this is very much a first impressions hands-on. I will do a full review when I've had a production copy and I've had an opportunity to put it through its paces. But without further ado, I do have enough information and some sample images to talk about this lens, so let's dig in. So before we get to the new lens, I do want to point out a few things about the Zeiss Otus lineup and what makes an Otus lens. So the Otus lineup was introduced, or was announced in 2012, it came out in 2013. This was the first lens in that lineup. This was the 55mm f1.4. There were 4 lenses in the lineup, all f1.4, all apochromatic designs. We had a 28, a 55, an 85, and then a 100mm, and they are incredible lenses. Now, typically when any company sets out to design a new lens, they come up with what are called design targets. Design targets include things like what is the price point, what is the intended user, what kind of lens materials are available to make elements with, what's weight going to be, what's the autofocus going to be. All of these things are parameters that go into designing a lens. The team will then take those parameters and design within them. Now, with the Otus series, this was very unique at the time because there really weren't any design parameters put on these lenses. There was no restrictions on price, no restrictions on weight, there was no autofocus. The charge was to optically make the most perfect lens Zeiss could possibly do at the time, and these lenses are incredible for those reasons. Now, if we look at the new Otus ML 50mm 1.4, we can see that there are some parameters put on this lens. The idea now is the lens does need to be smaller and more compact as it is designed for mirrorless. It will be a new design, and I do believe that the price point needed to be about half of what the original lenses were. So what this is going to bring us to is what are the features of this lens, and does it still have the look and the quality and the amazing things that make a Zeiss Otus a Zeiss Otus? So that's what we're going to dig into in this video. First of all, the build quality on the new ML 50mm is exceptional. It is an all-metal lens. There is no focus by wire. This is a true manual focus lens. I think in many ways it actually is a very technical lens because it does have a very long focus throw of about 260 degrees. It's the same as the original Otus 55mm. Now, I do want to note that while the ML 50mm is definitely smaller and lighter than the original DSLR mount Otus, it is worth noting that the weight comes in at almost 700 grams, or around 1.5-ish pounds. Having said that, it does balance nicely in your hands, but it is on the heavy side for a mirrorless lens. It's also worth noting that the optical design on this lens is completely new. The original Otus 55mm used an optical configuration of 12 elements in 10 groups. There was 1 aspherical element and 7 special glass elements. The new design now features even more elements. It's 14 elements in 11 groups, and there are 2 aspherical elements as well as 8 special glass elements. Now, I'm showing you these 2 designs side by side to emphasize that 1, this is a brand new design, but also in the last 6 years or so that Zeiss have not been in the lens game producing new lenses, there have been a lot of changes, especially when it comes to mirrorless. Zeiss has taken this lens very seriously, and the optical design does reflect the newer trends that we're seeing today. So most importantly, we're going to look at some images here, and I want to talk about the Zeiss look that you hear people talk about, what that means to me, and does this new lens have it? And I believe that it does. This first image was shot wide open, obviously, at f1.4. The 3 ingredients to the Zeiss look for me are, first of all, the subject isolation at portrait type distances, and you can see it certainly has that. She gets very isolated into this 3-dimensional type look. That also includes the bokeh, which would be the second ingredient for me. The bokeh is very smooth on this lens. No lines are doubling up. Everything is very non-distracting, very natural looking. It looks amazing. Now, the third one that I think defines the Zeiss look is something you hear people talk about when they refer to micro contrast. And what this means are details and textures with very small details when you're shooting wide open at f1.4. So if we take an image like this one, for instance, and I zoom in on the coffee cup here, and you can see all the bubbles that are in here, the way the The cream is kind of melting through the coffee there. We have an enormous amount of micro contrast, and it looks amazing. You're going to see that in a lot of the images that I'm going to show you here. Another case for that three-dimensional type look is an image like this. I'm probably about 4 or 5 feet from this first rock here, which is my point of focus. You can see the micro contrast once again. If I back out and zoom out on that, this is where these lenses really shine, is that you get that three-dimensional look. You have things that are perfectly in focus, and it's almost like you have planes that exist as things start to go out of focus in the back, and it's really beautiful. Another example I want to point out when we talk about sharpness corner to corner. So this is a tea house that sits on a pond. This is at the Botanical Gardens here in Fort Worth. If I zoom into where my focus point was on this wall, you get all this texture and all this detail in here. This is a Sony A7R4, so we got 60 megapixels that we're working with. I'm going to zoom back out. Sharpness corner to corner, if I go down to the bottom of this image, this just happened to be in the focal plane, you can see the sediment that's on top of the pond there and the fish going underneath. Everything is perfectly sharp. It's beautiful. And if we get in a little closer, I want to point out on this, the texture in the wood grain over here against the bokeh. If I zoom in, you get all that texture in there, all the details. The contrast is just exceptional in this lens. It really is tight. Now, this lens does display a little bit of pincushion distortion, which is kind of interesting on a 50 millimeter. You can see that in the technical data that Zeiss provides, but you can see it in an image such as this when you look at the baseboard on this fence here and how it bows upward just a little bit. Now, things like that are easily correctable in post-production, and because I have a pre-production of this lens, I'm working with Lightroom and there is no lens correction for it. I expect that that is something that is very controllable in post. Another thing that's nice is with this lens, there is very little vignetting when it's wide open. That was not the case with the DSLR mount Otus lenses. They did, the 55 in particular, had a lot of vignetting. These look great wide open. In fact, all these shots, unless I'm going to tell you, are shot at f1.4, which is really cool. I want to do this again just because it's amazing to see the level of detail. But on this fence gate here, if I zoom in, right here, you can see this little orange leaf that's sitting there. The amount of detail on these lenses is just fabulous. Again, this is wide open at f1.4. I can zoom back out and you can see the level of detail that we're looking at there. It's just phenomenal. Now, another thing about this lens that I did notice is that it does flare really easily. All these shots that I did at the Botanical Gardens are in really high contrast, so it's really pushing the lens to its limit. It is important to use the lens hood, but another thing that I noticed is there is a little bit of chromatic aberration that seeps in from time to time. If I go back to this fence wall here and I zoom in, you can see that this is backlit, but I start to see some edges on here that are a little less than ideal. Let's go into 200% so you can see it. There is some slight magenta going on here, but again, this is backlit. It is very high contrast, but it does exist. Now, one other thing that I want to show you that may not seem impressive at first, but it's very impressive to me, is I did a series of images where I put the camera on a tripod and I just did a picture of a scene at every aperture. I did this from the minimum focus distance to medium focus distance to almost infinity. The lens performs exceptionally well. And what's interesting about it, you can see on this one, I was shooting this at the minimum focus distance. This one's a little hard to tell because the light does change on me as I go through these images. I couldn't control that and it was a windy day, but you can see that pretty much the lens stays intact. There's not a whole lot of vignetting, just a little bit. But as I go down, you're just going to see the bokeh balls just get smaller in the back. The lens is very consistent in how it performs. Another thing that's kind of interesting to me is you can see at the medium distance where the contrast just changes slightly from wide open at f1.4 to where it goes to f2. I'll zoom in on this sign so you can see. So you can see the micro contrast. This is at f1.4. When I go to f2, it tightens up just a little bit. We'll go back to f1.4. So it's a great lens wide open. You get all the micro contrasts. You've seen all my examples, but really if you want the peak performance of this lens, I think just stopping down to f2 is going to be your best bet if you've got enough light to do it. Another example that I will show you is at, this isn't quite infinity, but it is near infinity focus, where is put the focus point on this train car back here on the type. And you can see, unfortunately, there is a little bit of chromatic aberration again. This is very high contrast as it was overcast, but you can see that if I go down to f2, there's the f2, the chromatic aberration does go away and it tightens up that focus just a little bit. Go back to wide open, and here's f2. Now, I do realize that I am being a little bit nitpicky, especially for a first impressions video, but I do think it's important when you consider what Zeiss, particularly the Otus series, means, which is the pinnacle of what can be done with lens design. Does this new lens deliver? I think it is an excellent lens. All the little nitpicky things I could certainly live with, but when we're talking about the best of the best, and even if you look at the company in a historical perspective, those early Zeiss optics designers really defined the entire landscape that everything else is hinged on, even today. Those guys were real innovators and the real pioneers, and that's what I want to see Zeiss do. This new lens is excellent. It is amazing. However, it does come in at $2,500, and I think that's where the sticking point actually starts. But we're also talking about a company that has not released a lens since 2019, and so 6 years is not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. However, a lot has happened in that particular 6-year period. I mean, if you're talking about Sony, they've got extremely spherical elements. They've had a new coating since then. Even Nikon have incredible optics. Canon has done really well. Autofocus is another big deal. And at $2,500 for a manual focus lens, when you look at the Sony system, there is a G Master f1.4, which is also extremely good optically, and it's got incredible autofocus, and it's almost half the price. Nikon also has two 50mm lenses, the f1.8S, which is one of the best lenses in their system, which you can get for well under $1,000. And then there's also the 50mm f1.2, which is optically excellent. It is a little closer in price to what we're looking at with the Zeiss Otus, but it has autofocus as well. Of course, Canon also has a 50mm f1.2, which competes in the same price range. It also has autofocus. Now, speaking for myself, I definitely have use cases where I am very comfortable with manual focus. Remember, this does have a very long focus throw, and this won't be right for everybody. This ends up being a technical lens, and the reason it has a long focus throw is you have a lot of room to move when you're really trying to get something in focus and you're zoomed in and you're taking your time with a shot. However, it ends up being a little bit of a niche market because it is a pricey lens, even though the optics are excellent. But I think that the mass market is so used to autofocus now that it really does become a requirement for a lens. I want to see Zeiss succeed so badly with this. And I also think it's kind of a mistake that they come in with one lens here, here's one at the end of the year, and then we'll determine some other focal lengths later. I think they really need to have something in a group of lenses that people who this lens would appeal to are ready to jump on. And so I would obviously love to know what you guys think. I will do a full review on this when I've had some more time with this lens. I know I've been a little bit overcritical for first impressions. I do think it's important, and I would love to know what you think. So drop me a comment if you have any questions, and I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.